It's my pleasure to be introducing our next invited speaker for this year's TripleA workshop, Natasha Korotkova, who is joining us today from, I believe, the Lakeside Semantics community at the University of Constance in Germany, where she's a postdoctoral researcher. Natasha is one of the few people I know that is brave enough to seek meaningful interactions with philosophy, and specifically in her work on evidentiality, and that's something I greatly admire. But she also has an interest in cross-linguistic typology, which is why we invited her today for this talk, and the Slavic languages in particular. We'll be hearing today about hearsay and non-commitment, and I'm very much looking forward to her talk. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks, Vera. Yes, Zoom, hello, cooperate. Thank you. Yes, and like Vera said, I am very much interested in the interface between linguistics and philosophy, and this is one of the reasons I'm giving this talk here. I think there isn't that much interaction between philosophers of language on the one hand and the cross-linguistic semantic community on the other, but I think there should be. And linguists have shown that cross-linguistic research really matters for debates in philosophy of language, for example, shifted in lexicality. And the topic I'm talking about today also is highly relevant both for philosophy. I'll be talking about hearsay and speech acts, semantics, pragmatics, division of labor. But of course, a lot of this work is rooted in cross-linguistic research. And this is kind of a mission I have for today. So let's get started. Just a general background for this talk, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. I'll be talking about evidentiality. Traditionally, in the typological literature work by Eichenwald, evidentiality is understood as a linguistic category that talks about information source. One has a textbook by now, example of an evidential paradigm from Kuska-Kecha, work by Martin and Fowler. All sentences in one talk about the same proposition. It is raining. So that's the scope proposition of evidentials. And then we have different morphemes that signal how the speaker and root declaratives learned it. For example, me signals that I learned it firsthand, typically this perception. Cha for inference and C for hearsay. And those are the morphemes that I will be talking most about today. On a methodological note, and I think it's very important, as semanticists, we shouldn't be concerned with paradigms as much. So yes, we have languages like Quechua that have this nice, neat paradigm, but also we shouldn't be discarding languages like German, for example, Wohl, that Malte has worked on, or even English, allegedly or reportedly. Semantically, they can be construed as evidentials as well. And this is a lightning slide that summarizes almost by now 25 decades of research on this topic. In formal semantics and pragmatics, it has been shown that in ways, different expressions of evidence are similar. And we see it across environments, dialects, attitudes, questions. This led to semantic proposals where evidentials are treated as kind of a uniform category, either as epistemic models within Kratzerian semantics or as elocutionary force operators. And all of those approaches hardwire the and there are others. There is some variation that can so we shouldn't hear about as much. But today, I'm talking about a systematic case of genuinely variation in whether or not evidential statements require endorsement. And there is a general divide in hearsay and non-hearsay. The 7 questions that I will try to address in this talk. Why is it only hearsay? How much variation do we really see? And of course, what are the best ways to model it formally? And before I talk about theoretical issues, let's look more closely at the data. Here is the main pattern. It is illustrated too, and it has been first described as many others that really do too much work. So we have a contrast. Me, that we've seen before, in 2A, training IC, it requires endorsement, or you can call it commitment, either phi or a modelized version thereof. It doesn't matter for the purposes of the stock. So you cannot say it's raining me, but I don't believe it. On the other hand, our friend C, the reportative, allows absence of endorsement. In true B, we can have something like, it said that it is raining, it's raining C, but I don't believe it. Perfectly good. And this is cross-linguistically very common, as has been shown by Scott Andrew in his overview. And interestingly, in Quechua, we do have dedicated morphology. So we have C, we have Chai, and me. There's a split. But there are languages where indirect evidence is expressed by one morpheme, both inference and hearsay. It is very common in the languages of the Balkans, Anatolia, Caucasus region, so illustrated with Georgian, but you can also see it, for example, in Bulgarian. We have morphology that can express inference on hearsay depending on the context. And then with inference, we have endorsement. This is 3A, a perfectly natural context for inference. I have visual evidence. Maria has red eyes. I infer that she was crying. Maria's uteria. I want to say that, but later I learned it was actually a different cause. She had an allergy. I tried to cancel that inference. Doesn't work. I cannot say I inferred that she was crying, but that's not true with an evidential. However, the same morphology in a different context with a report, perfectly fine with non-endorsement. California legalized marijuana, it said, but that's not true. So this is good. And so this is interesting. So there's really something about hearsay versus non-hearsay, not just about particular morphemes. And one of the important methodological issues here, and I'm bringing it up here because this is the community that really is interested in diagnosing things empirically. How do we know that something requires or does not require endorsement? We use disavowals. And there are different linguistic shapes. I can say, well, phi is not the case. I know that not phi. I don't believe that phi. Those are different things. For example, asserting not phi asymmetrically entails that I'm also in a position to assert I don't believe phi. But they're not the same, and this is consequential for semantic theory. So the type of disavowal we're using actually is indicative of what it is that endorsement is about. And this is why I'm using the term endorsement in a very theory neutral way. So far, so good. There's hearsay, lack of endorsement, there's non-hearsay, obligatory endorsement. But in fact, there's further variation. In particular, we can have obligatory endorsement even with hearsay markers. Has first been shown for the word Salish, Gibson is similar, but also Turkish. Turkish otherwise is very similar to Georgian. We have a morpheme mish, denotes inference and hearsay. And in 4A and 4B, we see that regardless of the context, we cannot disavow this claim. It snowed in LA, Karyamish, but I don't believe it. This is a bad follow-up, regardless of whether or not you interpret it as inference or as hearsay. Furthermore, even when endorsement may or may not be present, so we diagnose it with disavowals, potentially optional, there is a situation that we can call endorsement by default, very frequent. When I'm making a hearsay claim, unless I disavow later, it seems that actually I do believe the scope proposition. For example, in 5, Dutch reportative Heinen, if I say the tea is said to be delicious, it seems to be, it's a special raising verb. It usually also means that, okay, I haven't tried it, but I think that if I do, I will like it. This is in contrast with, for example, German Sollen, which seems to convey distancing. If I say dieser Tee soll lecker sein, I'm not committing myself to the idea that this tea will be good when I try it. In fact, it seems that I have some doubts about it. And this is different from other modal claims. If I say this tea must be tasty, or dieser Tee muss lecker sein, that implies that, okay, I have not tried it, but I will when I do. So there is something semantic going on, and we want to account for that. And this is the emerging typology that ideally our theory would be able to handle. And by the way, there's also an appendix where I go through the embedded environments, because I think we should always look at attitudes. The pattern is the same. So the commitment, the endorsement shifts to the attitude holder, but it's still the same, either present or absent or optional. So here are the major facts. Non-hearsay evidentials, direct and inference, we have always obligatory commitment. Some inferentials are weak. They allow statements like must, might modals, something like evidentially fi and evidentially not fi, but never flat out disavowals. And then we have hearsay. We have obligatory endorsement. We have optional endorsement present by default. Then we have hearsay evidentials that have some kind of a dubitative component. And we want to account for all of that. So of course, first, we need an account that handles disavowals, a formal thing that allows us to have those statements without a contradiction. We want a principled explanation of why non-hearsay is uniform. And finally, we do want to account for variation. And this is what I'm setting out to do. I will propose an account that is based in the discourse status of evidential statements. But before I do that, I want to quickly go over previous approaches, because I think it's important not to have a crusade, but there have been a lot of advances in this literature, and some views are very interesting. So let's take a closer look. I'm not the first one to talk about this problem. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are two major families of approaches to evidentials: modal views and elocutionary views. Hearsay disavowals have been used as a very strong argument for elocutionary approaches to evidentiality as a whole. Because we have this, evidentiality cannot be analyzed as a modality, at least within Kratzerian semantics, people have argued. It is something else. For example, it is about speech acts. But as we all know, modality is very difficult to define. Kratzerian semantics is just one framework. There are many others. There's a very interesting, lively debate in philosophy of language of what must claims mean. And when we try to define it as a natural class, we see that it's difficult to do. One starting point of this debate can be the literature of the modal future. And in fact, our formal tools are very powerful, and modal approaches within Kratzerian semantics or otherwise can handle most of the data. And the differences are mostly conceptual. And I want to emphasize it. I don't want to minimize the fact that there is a major difference between saying that something is like must and that something interacts with the discourse commitments, but this is not necessarily an empirical difference. So here's our conundrum, the main thing we want to explain. I hear phi, but it's not phi, or but I don't believe phi. From the modal point of view, this is a problem because epistemics, at least epistemics as we know them from English, require endorsement of phi or box phi or diamond phi. There must be water on Mars, but I don't believe it. This is bad, and this is a semantic contradiction. It's not pragmatic. With hearsay, we see that similar sentences are good, therefore, they're not epistemics. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here. We cannot use must as a stand-in for epistemic modality. And we don't want to conflate natural classes. So what modality really is a question that is difficult to answer, and properties of the formalism. And okay, must doesn't do that, but actually there is a variety of modal solutions on the market within Kratzerian semantics that allow us to derive disavowals. There is an appendix on that, and I want to go one option, the most classical semantics for must, Kratzer 1991. And again, this is a debate about whether or not must is strong. In Kratzer 1991, must is weak. Namely, it's not a marker of epistemic necessity. Must phi does not entail phi. As Yalson has pointed out, this actually makes incorrect predictions for must itself because it does allow contradictions. But by the same token, standard Kratzerian semantics for evidentiality, as has been first proposed by Rita Pancheva in her very influential paper in 1997, means that, okay, well, what we derive hearsay just fine. Many ways to do that formally. Crucially, what we do is we exclude W, the world of evaluation, from the quantifier domain. Therefore, it doesn't have to always be a phi world. A very schematized version in 8 we say that hearsay phi will be true in all of the most normal worlds compatible with what is known in W. And by the way, there is a typo here. What is known in W, not in W prime. So it is a universal quantifier, yes, but it doesn't quantify over all of the worlds that verify propositions on the model base. There is also an ordering source, which induces a ranking on those worlds. And how we define what is normal and what is not, well, maybe we take into account reliability. So if the source is not trustworthy, then maybe the world of evaluation should not be included. We solve the problem. There are several other ways to do that, but crucially, there's a way to do that within Kratzerian semantics. So of course, there's an account of disavowals. There's also obviously a lot of space for variations, depending on how we combine ordering sources and model bases. We get all the variation we want and even more. So freewheeling Kratzerian framework can get you a lot of data. Sometimes it overgenerates, but here it is possibly a good thing because we can stipulate in the lexical entry for each particular hearsay evidential which kind of contextual background it makes reference to. And here we run into a general problem with this framework, how we choose model bases. And it's also not clear how we explain the difference between hearsay and non-hearsay. Why is it the case that, for example, only hearsay is not strong enough? And it is really a problem. I'm not saying it's unsolvable, but more work needs to be done. But now I want to move on to a different view. And by the way, if somebody has a burning question that prevents them from understanding the rest of the talk, just speak up right now. So I don't want you to get lost. Any questions so far? No, we're good. Great. So some different outlook on evidentiality. It really is about assertion, what assertion is, what speech acts we're making, and discourse commitments. And like I said before, I think that the major difference is not empirical, but conceptual. In particular, elocutionary views on evidentiality make use of the notion discourse commitments. They entered linguistics jargon thanks to work by Kirsten Gunlickson on revising declaratives in English. Discourse commitments are different from private beliefs in that they're public, and I may not even believe what I'm committed to in the discourse. I only hold it for the sake of the conversation. There is a growing literature in linguistics that argues that commitments is really a defining characteristic of speech acts in general. A lot of work by Mark Krivka, for example, and started with Harkish and Bruce. For example, it has been argued that what distinguishes imperatives, go, and deontic modals, you should go, ought to go, have to go, is the presence of a commitment. In a domain more similar to what I'm talking about now, communicative predicates like say that describe discourse moves have been argued to differ from doxastic predicates like think and believe, precisely because they have a commitment. And that explains certain interesting patterns with how we choose the subjects, for example. And an Esli plug, I think it's very important to advertise it. Bart Gertz is teaching a class on commitments at Esli in July and August. If you're not completely sick of Zoom by then, and probably most of you are already now, highly recommended. Esli is always fun, and now it's an opportunity to take all those classes without going there. But, so taking a step back, okay, linguists think that when we talk about speech acts, we talk about commitments, therefore, analysis of evidentiality within speech act frameworks make reference to commitments. But in fact, this is an ongoing debate, in particular in philosophy. Commitments may not be necessary. We can analyze speech acts, for example, as intention recognition, work by Daniel Harris. And also, this view kind of doesn't really pay attention to modal assertions. And this is also something that is not really accounted for within the Kratzerian framework, but there are other ways to think about modality. And the more down-to-earth practical note is, okay, maybe we have commitments, maybe we don't. How do we diagnose the presence of commitment? Coming back to evidentials and endorsement, when we talk about endorsement, We try to look whether or not disavowals are possible. How we diagnose it? We use things like, but I don't believe phi. How is that a discourse commitment rather than a private belief? I don't know. And I wanted to point this out because I think it's a very tricky empirical issue and it's hard to tell the difference. But still, there are approaches that have shown that it is possible to treat evidentials using commitments. And from that standpoint, the non-endorsement problem looks as follows. When I'm making an assertion, I am endorsing phi. I have to have good enough evidence for that, knowledge, justified belief, commitment, or maybe this is pricing quality. But this is a fact. I cannot assert things I'm not sure about or that I know for sure to be false. But then with hearsay statements, we see that I can say, well, I heard phi, but I know it is not true, or but I don't really believe it. Therefore, it is not an assertion, or at least it's not assertable. There are several elocutionary solutions. One of the solutions that I will quickly go over now is the idea that, well, such speech acts are not assertions. In particular, they can be argued to be the speech act of presentation. This is work by Martina Fowler, a recent paper in S&P, a very interesting proposal. It relies on the idea that there is a mapping between clause types and speech acts therefore. Traditionally, in this literature, declaratives are mapped to assertions. Fowler proposes that no, the default speech act is actually not an assertion. It's an act of presentation. I put something on the table and I say, okay, well, this is the issue we can discuss. 9, eating chocolate is unethical. Discuss. It may result in an assertion, but then it doesn't have to. In particular, speech acts with hearsay present phi, don't necessarily assert it. The framework is probably familiar, Farkas and verse, conversational forward. The main component that we're interested here is the table. This is how we record issues, things we want to discuss, and the goal of a successful conversation is to clear the table, resolve all issues. When I'm presenting something, I'm putting phi on the table, and also we have discourse commitments of the interlocutor, speaker, and the addressee. We update them. In particular, we have truth commitments, and we also have commitments related to evidence. Good enough evidence, reportative evidence, indirect evidence, etc., etc. And when I'm making an assertion, additionally, my intention is to increase our common knowledge and to add phi to the common ground. And this is the component that is lacking with hearsay. This is illustrated in those two tables. There are additional assumptions. First, the speaker is not just the speaker. There are actually different roles. First, there is a person who's physically uttering a sentence. There is also the principal, the person whose commitments or beliefs or ideas are being communicated. They can be the same person, but they don't have to. And with hearsay, the idea is that I am uttering something that has been the subject of a previous discourse. I may be committed to it. I don't have to. And this is what happens. When we don't have an overt disavowal, the collaborative principle claims that, okay, it means that you're really committed to this. You hold it to be true. And this is what happens in the left table. With an utterance of a hearsay claim without a disavowal, I present phi. I'm saying that there was a previous discourse. The principal is committed to phi. I have reportative commitment because I heard it. By the way, I also believe it myself. But when I do have a follow-up, I'm just not committed to it. And this is the primary difference. This is how we handle presence or absence of commitment. And this is how we handle whose commitments we're talking about, because we introduce another person in our semantics. We do account for disavowals. Because we split the speaker roles, we can also explain why only hearsay evidentials do that. Because only in those cases do we have a possibility that somebody else is the principal, because there was the previous discourse. But because ultimately we're talking about a pragmatic collaborative principle, it's not clear how we explain variation. Presumably, this is something that I don't think was fully explored. If such principles are universal, how do they work? Are all evidentials supposed to be perceived as committal if there is no follow-up? What happens to speech verbs and other speech reports? Am I supposed to always be committed when I'm making a claim of the form Magda says XYZ? It's really not clear. And also, and this is a conceptual problem, not clear what the predictions are for embedded clauses. There are frameworks that allow to have embedded commitments. But then it's not clear why we need it at all, because the Farkas and Bruce model is not designed to handle anything related to attitudes. This is a model of assertion and questions. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's important to raise those issues. And also, I want to talk about another idea that is agnostic about whether or not evidentials make reference to commitments. Something that I have not said yet, but this is something that you would know if you read anything about evidentiality. Starting point of most, if not all, approaches is the idea that evidential statements make two contributions. There's at issue contribution, and there's a not at issue contribution. In 10, Tovli Mosula, it's node. I here infer. My main point of an utterance is that it's node. By the way, this is how I learned it. An explicit parallel has been made with constructions in English that are always not at issue. It has been argued that really evidentials have the same semantics as appositives, slifting parentheticals, non-restrictive relative clauses. For example, 11b, Polina, my friend, is giving a talk later today. The point that I want to convey is, well, Polina is giving a talk. By the way, she's a friend of mine. This somehow bypasses this issues on conversation. It has been argued to not be an assertion, but to be a secondary assertion. And the idea has been really, this is how evidentials work as well. And then, of course, you do have a problem. So again, another formulation of the same problem we've seen. I hear phi, but it's not the case that phi. Asserted content has to be endorsed. It also has to be an issue. I cannot assert something which is peripheral. Why would I assert it? Then, okay, phi is not endorsed, as we've seen with disavowals. Therefore, it cannot be asserted. But also, my statement about my evidence, the fact that I have hearsay evidence for phi, has been argued to always be not at issue. Therefore, it cannot be asserted either. And my proposal is that evidential restrictions are not conventional triggers of not at issue content. They can have a variable discourse status. They are backgrounded by default, but they can become foregrounded. In particular, this is what happens with disavowals. Why do I say that I heard phi, but I don't believe it? Presumably because I want to make the fact that there's information of hearsay sort about phi at issue. Otherwise, it's not really clear why am I making a claim and following up with a statement, well, this claim is false. That's the basic idea. And for that, we need to understand what at issue or at not at issue content is. This, in many ways, has started with the work by Chris Potts and has been picked up lately, especially Judith Tonhauser, Matthew Simons, David Beaver, and Kirk Roberts. Lots of work on this. Intuitively, the distinction is clear. When you're making an utterance, something has to be the main point, what the utterance is about, and then there's other information, in particular presuppositions, but not only. But content isn't at issue or not at issue simpliciter. What is at issue under one definition based on a set of diagnostics may come out as not at issue or at issue in a different definition. So there are different formal notions of construing at issueness. And when we're talking about evidentiality, it's important to distinguish between them and look at diagnostics that tell us that evidential contribution is at issue or not at issue. I have a paper on this, and the gist is that out of the proposals that we have, probably the best one for evidentials is the QUD view on at issueness, which relies on the general architecture of discourse and relevance to the current question under discussion, something that came up also yesterday in the discussion of topic and focus. proposition can only be at issue if the speaker intends to address the community with it, for which it has to be relevant to the community, but also entail a complete or partial answer. And with this view of attentiveness, relevance to the current QUD, we can look at the diagnostic of answerhood. Whether or not content can address the QUD by answering explicit or implicit questions. For example, coming back to positives, those 15 parentheticals, they never answer questions. For example, who's Paulina? Paulina, my friend, is giving a talk at the TripleA. This is bad, even though we could say, well, it contains information. So for evidentials, it hasn't been used as much as I think it should have been, but for those where it has, it seems that evidentials never answer questions about evidence. Evidential statements can only answer questions about the scope propositions. So they built the metro line, a new metro line in LA. Perfectly good answer to the question about public transit. Bad if the question is about my evidence. So in this case, the evidential restriction cannot answer the question, therefore it's QUD not at issue. But the important thing about this definition really is that it is pragmatic, it's not semantic. It relies on information structure, and the status at issue, not at issue status of a content may change if the discourse changes. And this is the idea for evidentials and for evidential disavowals. This is a situation where evidential restriction, which is backgrounded by default, becomes at issue. And such statements, if we think about speech acts, are regular assertions. And the semantics we can have for evidentials is a simple first-person attitude report, something like I hereby, without saying that also, this is just like English lifted parentheticals, that it lives at a separate dimension, however you want to analyze it. And I think this is a bonus. But also there's support from conventional triggers of not at issue content in English. The idea is that if disavowals signal that some content becomes at issue, then things like lifting parentheticals would not allow them. And I think this checks out. In 13a, the Democrats won, she claimed, but I don't lost. This is bad. The Democrats won, I hear, but I don't believe it. You don't necessarily commit fully to this claim. You can say they won, I hear, but I'm not so sure. But I'm not so sure only indicates that an epistemic state is not decided on phi. But it's not the same as claiming not phi. And this is the prediction of this type of view. On the other hand, discourse parentheticals, 13d, she claimed that the Democrats won. Such sentences may address different questions. They may address the question about the complement clause. They also may address questions about who said what. And they allow disavowals. She claimed that the Democrats won, but I don't believe it. This is good. And of course, here comes the issue of at issueness and not at issueness in a given language. Much of this research has been done on English, German, and some other familiar languages, with the exception of presuppositional triggers. So what are the constructions that we can compare evidentials to? Catcher, Cheyenne, Georgian, etc. And what are the means of signaling that a particular content is not at issue? In English, with parentheticals, we know that this is not just syntax. Comma intonation indicates that something is peripheral. In Yucatec Maya, topic marking can be used for clauses that are marked as not at issue. But the big question is, how does it behave cross-linguistically? And this is, I think, a very rich area for future research. So hopefully maybe some of you will be interested in doing this. Moving on, I want to say that we can use this idea of variable at issue status also to explain default endorsement. As a reminder, in many languages, hearsay phi is interpreted as though the speaker is endorsing phi unless it is cancelled by an explicit disavowal. There are analyses of that. They're mostly pragmatic. For example, the collaborative principle, you're committed unless you say you're not. But it also looks like an obligature. It's there unless you cancel it. Really. And then we don't have to talk about speech acts, and we know obligatures and that beautifully. We have very clear predictions. And I think it can be analyzed as a relevance obligature. By default, the fact that I have hearsay evidence for phi is not at issue. then again, by default, phi is at issue. In the QUD view, it will be relevant to the QUD. And then it will be only at issue when I also believe it or believe some version of it. Otherwise, why would it be at issue? That's the gist. And of course, there's probably more to be done. And one question that arises here, okay, so there are evidentials that are committal by default. Can there be evidentials that are epistemically neutral? Someone said phi is neutral. Maybe I'm endorsing it, maybe I don't. What about evidentiality? And I think that really this has to do with that issueness. If the evidential restriction is not at issue by default, then maybe we can have a neutral report. Otherwise, I think it's weird because again, why would I say that if the fact about evidence, my having evidence is not at issue, and also I'm not really endorsing it? What's the point of this utterance? So it's really a pragmatic calculation. And the main idea is that thinking about at issueness versus not at issueness in discourse can help us explain two puzzles that have been received, have received a lot of attention in the literature, but looked through a different lens, disavowals and default endorsement. And that brings me to the second point, speech reports. Remember, commitment by default is not always the case. We also have variation. And I think it's not surprising at all. Speech reports are a heterogeneous category. Philosophers have thought a lot about it, especially in the context of quotation, but linguists have identified a plethora of configurations that deal with speech reporting, and they differ. So just in English alone, we have a variety of communicative verbs, assert, claim, report, shout, whisper, and so on. They differ. Then we have quotation, mixed quotation. Languages like German have reportative subjunctives, and so on. So if we look at hearsay, in this context, we shouldn't be surprised that we see variation. Hearsay evidence is not a kind of semantic primitive. We do expect that maybe hearsay in, say, Turkish differs from hearsay in Quechua. Even if it follows the same template, the ultimate accessibility relation or the predicate can be different. In particular, remember some hearsay evidentials require endorsement. Again, we have speech verbs that do agree or be right, have a veracity entailment. They're not factive, but they indicate that the speaker believes content of a previously made claim. I agree that Constance is lovely, presupposes that there was a previous discourse. It also entails that I believe this claim. And we see that this is an entailment because it does not project under negation. So potentially hearsay evidentials can be of the same nature. There are hearsay evidentials like say, there are hearsay evidentials like agree. And then of course, we can have some evidentials like disagree. Remember, there are markers like German Zollern that indicate distancing. And we do have non-neutral speech reports. First disagree, but also mixed quotation. This is a technique used in journalism. You want to be accurate and preserve the exact words, but also frequently it signals that you are not really committed to this claim. For example, since 16b, there's a clear lack of endorsement. Warrant claimed that it was politically, the single pair was politically unacceptable, quotes. Jacobin is a leftist venue. They have a very different view on what is politically acceptable or not. Or in 16a, we can even have a contradiction. Extinct pygmy elephants have been found living on Borneo. If you remove quotes, this is infelicitous. Furthermore, another parallel from the domain of speech of clause-taking predicates, there are languages which have predicates that mean something like falsely believe. X thinks blah, blah, blah. They are wrong. Why can't we have a speech predicate like that? We can possibly analyze it as having a dubitative component, something that induces a ranking with references and not firewalls, but we prefer to firewalls. So this is all technically possible, but crucially, again, not unexpected, because speech reports vary, and this is a case of lexical variation, which we in fact expect. And there are other instances of variation in hearsay and in evidentiality in general, also probably lexical difference in evidence types. One important thing here is that if we do have such variation, it's probably indicative that differences stem from semantics and are not due to general pragmatic principles. And I may be wrong, and maybe there is a different, better explanation. But I think that this is something that should be investigated more closely, which brings me to my last point about lack of variation in hearsay. So I've been talking about how we have endorsement or lack of endorsement with hearsay, speech predicates vary, hearsay evidentials vary. There's one thing that we don't find, or at least haven't found so far. Non-hearsay evidentials across the board ban disavowals. Here is the Georgian example again. We have similar examples in other languages, something like, it's raining cha, but I don't believe it. It's raining cha, but I'm not sure, etc. So you cannot cancel having made an inference. Previous explanations are linguistic. Something special about hearsay, there's another perspective. Inference, on the other hand, does not introduce another perspective. Therefore, we have a pattern, the pattern for free A. I think that have a non-linguistic explanation paired with linguistic facts. Grammar here reflects a fundamental property of inference. Whenever we're making an inference, we endorse the conclusion at the moment. With deduction, it will be something that logically follows from the premises, so it will be always true. With abduction, it's the best explanation at the moment. But still, if you concluded that diamond phi, that's what you believe at the moment. Some inferences are defeasible later and subject to belief revision. So this is non-linguistic facts. This is a fact about inference. But language reflects this. Inferential expressions, which include inferential and direct evidentials, but also, for example, doxastic predicates that talk about inference, if they are evaluated at T, then we cannot have a simultaneous disavowal. 17a, I infer, guess, assume that there's water on Mars, but I don't believe it. So if I infer something, then it also means that I came to believe it based on the results of the reasoning process. But then in some cases, we can have temporal displacement. So this is the belief revision. I inferred that there's water on Mars, but I was wrong. The thing with evidentials is that most of the time they scope above tense. So here in Georgian, the idea was that we can try to displace it, we can't. And this is a linguistic fact that what we can do with a full-fledged verb, that means roughly the same thing, we can do with an evidential. And I think this is a promising explanation that really the fact that we always have endorsement with non-hearsay, direct evidentiality, and inference is not a random fact of grammar. It has to do with the nature of cognitive processes described by evidentials, and of course also there's linguistic facts to be explained. So a quick summary. I propose an account of disavowals that is rooted in the variable discourse status of evidential contributions. I think there is a principled explanation of non-hearsay that I just introduced. And we also do have spaces for variation in hearsay. And we don't really care as to whether or not we construe evidentials as modals or as speech act operators. And I have argued elsewhere that I don't think that those approaches truly differ. So far, so good. So there are other analytical options. I think they're worth exploring, even though I do like my proposal. But the reason I wanted to give a talk here is that I think there's lots of research to be done. Really careful cross-linguistic investigation of hearsay evidentials in the broader context of speech reporting. What are they and how much more variation or lack of variation do we see? And I don't know, but I hope that future research will tell. And just if you are interested in evidence and language more generally, Corinne Barry and I are editing a special issue journal of pragmatics on this. But for now, that's it. And Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And excellent timing. So we have 14 minutes for questions. And if you can, please use the raise hand function or just wildly wave at the screen, and I'm sure we figure it out. Mitchell, of course, has a well-behaved question with the raised hand. So over to you.
Thank you. Natasha, this is great. And I'm learning a lot, but I have a question which, is sort of a curiosity, but I think also relates to methodologically how we look at this actually in particular languages. And that has to do with the sort of the timing of the disavowal, right? So, and I mean, you made the connection to implicature, and I think they're related questions to implicature calculation. But for example, empirically, especially if hearsay phi, might by default commit the speaker to phi, then yes, you could disavow it immediately. But I wonder, how far along can you go and then continue to disavow it, right? So hearsay phi, here's another sentence, and then I say, I don't believe phi, right? Is that good or not? And is that a point where, where there might be cross-linguistic variation as well? Because, the kinds of evidence that we do see in the literature, right, where the kind of data points we have seem to be this immediate juxtaposition, right, of hearsay phi, it's false, or I don't believe it. And I might even, I could imagine that there could even be variation potentially, or something that we should at least control between, say, immediately juxtaposing it with something which is really an independent clause versus hearsay phi, but I don't believe it, right? Or and I don't believe it, right? Maybe that counts as closer and allows for cancellation in a way that a full stop would not. And so I'm wondering, what we know from this literature about exactly what amount of cancellation is allowed, but also, what your thoughts might be about how we should be looking at this, or what we should look at actually looking at this individual languages.
Great question. The short answer, I think, is we don't know, or I don't know. If you follow Fala's work, I think the claim would be that you have to disavow immediately. And I don't really know what kind of clash would happen. Okay, I said blah, 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 C, some other discourse. Oh, by the way, let's go back to this. I actually don't agree. I think the proposal predicts that we cannot do that. I should have said it right away. And I think for implicatures, it would be slightly different. The extent in general to which it is available in further discourse and further away, I don't think it has been studied. And it also matters for the type of anaphoric connections you can make to evidential claims as well. So it is a good question. Not much research on that yet.
Yeah, I was also thinking about anaphoric connections, but also like modal subordination, right?
Yes.
Depending on the sort of discourse move of the next utterance, if it's an elaboration or something, maybe you can continue later. But so I think it could be interesting to look at whether all of these kind of anaphoric dependencies within a particular language actually sort of follow the same logic or not, and that might relate to the claim of whether these are really implicatures or not, right?
Right. No, good point.
John.
Thanks, Natasha, for this great talk. I just have a question that I didn't quite understand from your talk, and I just want to ask you to go over again. So I'm trying to figure out what the difference is between a hearsay evidential marker and a quotative marker. Yeah, I think you may have addressed this in passing, but if you could maybe get back at it again. Thanks.
No, I actually did not address it. Great question. So yes, quotation is a type of speech report. How do we know they're not quotations? And I have actually looked at it. Quotation, at least classic quotation, direct discourse, is opaque to all kinds of dependencies. You don't have de re de dicto ambiguities. You cannot substitute. You typically have to use the same words. And with hearsay, what happens, at least languages I have looked at so far, it's not quotation in a way you can have substitutions. I don't have to repeat the exact words that have been said. So for example, I hear that, whatever, the dean is coming to the party. The report was something like, Regina is coming to the party. I know she's the dean. I'm substituting. Typical quotation does not allow that. That's the standard distinction between direct versus indirect discourse. But then we have other problems because we have free indirect discourse, so we have hybrid strategies, and we also have mixed quotation. This is a strategy where I can quote chunks of a sentence, unconstrained syntactically. So I just extract something, what I think matters, the specific formulation, and then I go on to repeat the content. So John said that he purchased a tent. If I want to mix quote it, I cannot substitute purchase for buy. And of course, we can potentially have a mixed quotation analysis. That's an open option. And I have tried to look at de re and dedictive evidentiality, and it's looking really weird. So there seems to be variation. So first, people don't really like de re dedictive context. It's difficult in the field. I work on this topic independently. And when you really try to push it, it seems that some evidentials, German Zollen, does not seem to allow de re. Turkish Mish does not seem to allow de dicta. And then there is potential variation, but because de re is difficult to test for, we don't really know. So to answer your question is, I don't think this is pure quotation. There are other analytical options, and we should push it further. And that is one of the reasons I think we should really look at hearsay in this much larger context. How can it be used? So we know it's not the same as reportative subjunctive because it can be used out of the blue. The reportative subjunctive in German refers to previous discourse that is easily recoverable from the context. Hearsay evidentiality, normally I can just use hearsay XYZ. So there is one difference. But this is a spectrum, as you will know. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. Your last point, I think, is well taken, that it's a spectrum, and I think these things can shift around a lot. And even within a language, within a speaker, I think you can sometimes...
Yes, and I think that that's the point. So we also don't necessarily expect that all hearsay will be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is really the point that I wanted to make. I think initially when this whole research program started, it was very appealing to think that, oh, this is a say verb, just a different syntactic shape. They would all behave the same way. And if we have any variation, let's try to do away with it. And maybe it's all pragmatics. And my point is that probably not.
Great, thanks, Natasha.
Natasha, can I quickly follow up on the last sentence that you've said? Just so I think you were very careful to say that a lot of the heavy lifting under this new proposal or this program is pragmatic, right? And I wonder how that compositionally then relates to these variable at issueness examples that you had, right? So what does this variability tell us about the formal analysis of at issueness, and especially the compositional analysis of at issueness? It's a very big question, but I think there's something that I was not quite following at this point. So this variability, it's pragmatically driven, but how does it actually work compositionally, given that that this material is somehow syntactically integrated in the utterances? Right.
So good question. I think the promising line of like really compositional semantics of work by Julie Hunter and Nick Asher on parenthetical attitude reports. So not things like, it's raining, I've been told, but things like, I hear it's raining. They have a variable discourse status. They're different from evidentials because They are not backgrounded by default. And they do have a compositional semantics. And the crucial difference here is from presupposition triggers or things like pods and conventional implicatures, because there, and this is mirror semantics, for example, you have a morpheme that always says, hey, I am not a tissue. I have a very special update associated with me, or I am a presupposition trigger, or I live in the expressive dimension or something. So here, yes, it would be different. And I think to address this, we also need to really understand how evidentials behave. So as I said, I think that the most promising diagnostic of auditioners in this case is answerhood. It hasn't been used widely, so we first need to establish that indeed they don't answer questions about evidence. Maybe in some languages they do, and if they do, then they are at issue in the QUD definition. And if they are not, I think the interesting question here, before we formulate how, the question is why. Why is it the case that frequently information about evidence is not at issue? The same question comes up in research on slurs. We know that various types of expressive content, especially slurs, are not at issue, maybe presuppositional, maybe something else. There's a debate. The question is, why is it the case? We know the effect that it has on the discourse. It's very difficult to challenge it later. That's why it's so damaging. And the same question with evidentials. And maybe one answer will be also very discourse-driven, pure speculation now, that it has something to do with discourse relations and generally how we provide evidence for claims is not what pushes the discourse forward. Therefore, it may be construed as not at issue in frameworks there at issueness is related to the discourse structure. For example, like so not just the QUD framework, but also other ways of thinking about not at issueness. And once we establish that, I think we will have a better way of looking at it compositionally, because I think the research has been somewhat the other way around. There's an assumption that evidentials are always not at issue. Previously, they have been treated as presuppositional. Now we have another line of thinking, and Murray proposes a very elaborate framework for this that is aiming at accounting for not at issue phenomena more generally, not just evidentiality, but also a positive, etc., etc. But I think we need to take a step back.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I guess ultimately I was just wondering, is there a role for syntax here, right? So is there specific syntactic restrictions on where at issueness can be marked in a sentence, and also where these
I don't know. So
yeah, no,
I really don't know. And with evidentials, yes, we can say that they're somewhere at the left periphery most of the time. So maybe that plays a role. So maybe it's a kind of light verb, and that contributes to it being not at issue as opposed to the full-fledged verb, but I don't know. But yeah, ultimately we would want to have an account.
Yeah, let's I think let's thank Natasha again for her talk, and I think we've lots to think about the research program she's kind of laid out for us today. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
We have a 20